On July 2nd, 1937, the most famous female pilot in history vanished into thin air over the Pacific Ocean. Emilia Echart was just 20 miles from her destination when her final radio transmission cut to silence. What happened in those last moments has baffled investigators for over 85 years. But new evidence suggests the official story might be completely wrong. Echart wasn't just any pilot. She was America's sweetheart, the woman who proved females could conquer the skies. Her round-the-world flight was supposed to be her greatest triumph. Instead, it became aviation's greatest mystery. That morning, Echart and her navigator Fred Noonan took off from New Guinea, heading for Howland Island, a tiny speck of land in the vast Pacific. They had been flying for over 20 hours when radio operators heard her voice crackling through the static. "We are running north and south." Then nothing, complete silence. The U.S. Coast Guard launched the largest search and rescue operation in history. 16 ships and 66 aircraft scoured over 250,000 square miles of ocean. They found nothing, not a single piece of wreckage, no oil slick, no trace of the Lockheed Electra that carried Echart and Noonan into oblivion. The official conclusion came quickly. Too quickly. Echart ran out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific Ocean. Case closed. The U.S. government declared both aviators dead and moved on. But this simple explanation ignores crucial evidence that doesn't add up. First, Echart's plane carried 22 hours of fuel. She had been flying for only 20 hours when she disappeared. That gave her 2 extra hours to find land, plenty of time to reach several islands in the area. Second, radio operators across the Pacific reported hearing distress signals for days after her disappearance. These weren't random static or wishful thinking. Multiple operators recorded clear transmissions from someone claiming to be Emilia Echart. One message, picked up by a radio operator in Florida, was chilling. SOS from Echart, radio in water, plane on reef southwest of island. Another transmission, received by a teenager in Texas, included background voices speaking what sounded like Japanese. The government dismissed all of these as hoaxes or misidentifications. But were they? The radio signals weren't just random voices. Betty Klenk, a 15-year-old girl in St. Petersburg, Florida, was listening to her radio on July 2nd when she heard a weak female voice saying, "This is Emilia Echart. This is Emilia Echart. Please help me." The girl frantically wrote down everything she heard over the next several days. The voice described being on land, mentioned water in the cockpit, and repeatedly asked for help. Betty's father, a radio expert, confirmed the signals were real. In Texas, another teenager named Nina Paxton picked up similar transmissions. She heard a woman's voice saying, New York, calling SOS, we have taken in water, plane broken." The voice mentioned being on a small island and said Fred was badly injured. Background voices could be heard speaking in what sounded like a foreign language. These weren't isolated incidents. Radio operators in Hawaii, California, and even as far away as Australia reported receiving distress calls that could have come from Echart's radio. The signals grew weaker each day, suggesting a battery slowly dying. After a week, they stopped completely. The most disturbing detail involves the search itself. While rescue teams searched the endless ocean, they barely looked at the islands nearby. Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro, sat just 350 miles southeast of Howland Island. It was uninhabited, had a flat reef perfect for an emergency landing, and lay directly on Earhart's flight path. Yet searchers gave it only a quick flyover before declaring it empty. The official search lasted 16 days and cost over $4 million, equivalent to $80 million today. But something doesn't make sense about how it was conducted. Ships were sent to areas hundreds of miles from Earhart's last known position, while closer islands received minimal attention. It's almost as if someone wanted the search to fail. Commander Warner Thompson, who led part of the search, later admitted they may have been looking in the wrong places entirely. In private letters discovered decades later, he wrote that political pressure forced them to focus on ocean searches rather than island-by-island sweeps. Someone didn't want Earhart found alive. In 1940, 3 years after Earhart vanished, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher made a discovery on Gardner Island that should have solved the mystery forever. While exploring the uninhabited coral atoll, he found human bones scattered near a campsite. The bones belonged to a tall woman, unusual for the Pacific Islands where the native population was typically much shorter. Gallagher immediately suspected these might be Earhart's remains. He carefully collected the bones and sent them to Fiji for analysis. The initial examination was promising. The bones appeared to belong to a white woman, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, exactly Earhart's height. But then something strange happened. The bones disappeared. Official records show they were shipped to London for further study, but they never arrived. No shipping logs, no customs records, no trace. It's as if someone made sure these bones would never be examined by independent experts. When researchers tried to track them down decades later, they found only empty file folders and missing documents. The disappearance wasn't accidental. Dr. David Hoodless, the physician who first examined the bones in Fiji, kept detailed notes of his findings. His measurements showed the skeleton belonged to a European woman between the ages of 35 and 40. Earhart was 39 when she disappeared. The bone structure indicated someone who had lived an active, athletic lifestyle. Most importantly, Hoodless noted unusual wear patterns on the bones consistent with someone who spent significant time in aircraft cockpits. But Gallagher found more than just bones on Gardner Island. Scattered around the campsite were metal fragments that matched the construction of Earhart's Lockheed Electra. A piece of aluminum with rivets identical to those used on her plane. Part of a navigational instrument. Most telling of all, a woman's compact mirror and a piece of plexiglass that could have come from an aircraft window. The compact mirror tells its own story. It was a Benedictine brand mirror, the exact type Earhart was known to carry. Photos of her preparing for flights show her using an identical compact. The mirror was found broken, as if it had been used as a signaling device to reflect sunlight toward passing aircraft. A standard survival technique Earhart would have known. The evidence suggested someone had survived on the island for weeks, possibly months. Gallagher found the remains of cooking fires, improvised tools, and signs that someone had been collecting rainwater. The campsite was positioned to have a clear view of the sky, perfect for signaling rescue aircraft. Scattered around the site were bird bones and turtle shells, evidence that the castaways had learned to survive on whatever food the island provided. More disturbing were the signs of a desperate struggle for survival. Gallagher discovered carved markings on trees that looked like attempts to keep track of days. He found pieces of cloth that appeared to have been used as bandages, stained with what could have been blood. Near the campsite, he uncovered a makeshift grave containing the bones of a man, possibly Fred Noonan, Earhart's navigator. Local islanders who later settled on Gardner Island told stories passed down from their grandparents. They spoke of finding airplane parts buried in the sand and seeing the bones of the tall woman before colonial officials removed them. Some claimed their ancestors had seen smoke signals rising from the uninhabited island in 1937, but Japanese patrol boats prevented anyone from investigating. The most detailed account came from an elderly woman named Nai Manganibuka, whose grandfather had been fishing near Gardner Island in late 1937. He told her he had seen a large silver bird crash into the reef and watched as two people emerged from the wreckage. The man appeared injured, and the woman helped him to shore. Nei's grandfather wanted to help, but Japanese warships in the area made it too dangerous to approach the island. Modern expeditions to the island have uncovered even more compelling evidence. In 1991, researchers found a piece of aircraft aluminum with the numbers 22SL1 stamped on it. These markings match the construction code used on Earhart's specific plane. They also discovered what appears to be part of a woman's shoe, size 9, exactly what Earhart wore. The shoe fragment was particularly significant. It was part of a size 9 Oxford heel, made by the Cat's Paw Rubber Company, the same brand Earhart purchased for her world flight. Analysis of the rubber showed it had been manufactured in 1936, consistent with when Earhart would have bought her shoes for the journey. The heel showed unusual wear patterns, suggesting the owner had spent considerable time walking on coral and rocks. In 2001, researchers discovered something even more personal. Buried in the sand near the campsite, they found fragments of a Benedictine jar, the same brand of freckle cream Earhart was known to use. The jar fragments were accompanied by pieces of a women's zipper from the 1930s, possibly from Earhart's flight suit. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came in 2012. Deep water sonar detected what looks like aircraft debris on the reef slope near Gardner Island. The object measures approximately 65 feet long, the same length as Earhart's Lockheed Electra. It sits at the exact depth where a plane would settle if it had initially landed on the reef, then later slipped into deeper water during high tide or rough weather. The sonar images show what appears to be landing gear, engine parts, and sections of wing structure. The debris field matches the expected pattern of an aircraft that made a controlled landing on a reef, then gradually broke apart and sank as ocean currents and storms battered the wreckage. Most recently, in 2019, forensic analysts used advanced computer modeling to re-examine Dr. Hoodless's original bone measurements from 1940. Using modern techniques, they determined the skeleton was 99% likely to belong to a woman of Earhart's height and build. The analysis also revealed something Hoodless had missed: evidence that the person had suffered a broken arm that healed improperly, exactly like an injury Earhart sustained in a 1924 flying accident. The evidence from Gardner Island paints a terrifying picture. Earhart and Noonan didn't die in a quick crash. They survived the landing and lived as castaways, possibly for months, desperately trying to signal for rescue. The woman, almost certainly Earhart, survived longer than her navigator, eventually succumbing to starvation, dehydration, or disease while still hoping for rescue that never came. But if this is true, why wasn't the island properly searched? Why did the bones disappear? And why did the government work so hard to suppress this evidence? The answers point to a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government. What if Earhart's disappearance wasn't an accident? What if she was on a secret mission for the US government and the Japanese military knew exactly where to find her? In 1937, tensions between Japan and America were rising fast. The Japanese had invaded China and were rapidly expanding their military presence across the Pacific. They had also begun fortifying islands in violation of international treaties, building airstrips and naval bases on tiny atolls they claimed were for fishing operations. Earhart's round-the-world flight took her directly through these restricted waters. Her route would carry her over dozens of Japanese-controlled islands, giving her a perfect opportunity to photograph military installations from the air. The US military desperately needed intelligence about Japanese fortifications, and who better to gather it than America's most famous female pilot? Evidence for this secret mission comes from several sources. First, Earhart's plane was equipped with extra radio equipment far beyond what was needed for navigation. She carried multiple transmitters capable of sending coded messages across vast distances. Second, her flight was funded partly by the US government through Purdue University, which had close ties to military research programs. Most telling of all, Earhart's planned route was changed at the last minute. Originally, she intended to fly west from California to Hawaii, then continue westward around the world. Instead, she flew east first, crossing the Atlantic and Africa before entering the Pacific. This eastern route took her directly over the most sensitive Japanese military zones. But the Japanese weren't fooled. They had been tracking Earhart's flight from the beginning and knew about her true mission. When her plane disappeared near Howland Island, Japanese patrol boats were already in the area, waiting. Multiple witnesses in the Marshall Islands reported seeing Earhart's distinctive silver plane forced down by Japanese fighters. The aircraft made a controlled landing in the shallow lagoon near Mili Atoll, where both aviators were taken prisoner. Local islanders watched as Japanese soldiers transferred Earhart and Noonan to a larger ship and sailed towards Saipan, then the headquarters of Japanese military operations in the Pacific. What happened next depends on which witness account you believe, but all point to the same conclusion. Earhart and Noonan were executed as spies. Josephine Blanco was a young girl living on Saipan in 1937 when she witnessed something that haunted her for the rest of her life. She watched Japanese soldiers march two American prisoners, a man and a woman, to a cemetery behind the Japanese military headquarters. The woman had short hair and wore men's clothing. The man appeared injured and could barely walk. Josephine heard gunshots and saw the soldiers return alone. Years later, after American forces captured Saipan during World War II, she led investigators to the burial site. They found the remains of two people, along with aircraft parts that matched Earhart's Lockheed Electra. Other witnesses on Saipan told similar stories. A Japanese civilian worker claimed he was forced to dig graves for 2 American aviators in 1937. A local businessman said he saw a white woman with short hair being held in a Japanese jail cell, repeatedly asking when she would be allowed to contact the American embassy. The most detailed account came from a Chamorro man named Jesus Salas, who worked at the Japanese seaplane base on Saipan. He claimed he saw Japanese mechanics examining pieces of a silver American aircraft with the registration numbers NR 16020. Earhart's exact plane identification. The wreckage was later loaded onto ships and disposed of at sea to eliminate evidence. But if this is true, why didn't the US government admit Earhart was on a spy mission? Why allow the myth of a crashed aviator to persist for decades? The answer lies in the political situation of 1937. America wasn't ready for war with Japan. Admitting that Earhart was spying would have given Japan justification for their military expansion and possibly triggered an earlier conflict. It was easier to let the world believe she had simply run out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. This cover-up became even more necessary after Pearl Harbor. If Americans learned that their beloved Emilia Echart had been captured and executed by the Japanese 4 years before the attack, public outrage would have been unstoppable. The government needed to control the narrative and the timing of America's entry into the war. The moment Earhart disappeared, a massive cover-up began. It reached from the highest levels of the Roosevelt administration down to local radio operators who were told to stop reporting the distress signals they were hearing. President Franklin Roosevelt personally ordered the Navy to conduct the most expensive search and rescue operation in U.S. history. But behind the scenes, he issued secret orders that told a different story. Classified documents released decades later reveal that Roosevelt knew far more about Earhart's fate than he ever admitted publicly. On July 19, 1937, just 2 weeks after Earhart's disappearance, Roosevelt held a secret meeting with Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Navy Secretary Claude Swanson. The meeting's official minutes were destroyed, but handwritten notes found in Hull's personal papers mention the Earhart situation and Japanese complications. The notes include the phrase, "maintain cover story at all costs." What makes Roosevelt's involvement even more suspicious is his personal relationship with Earhart. They had met several times at White House social events, and Roosevelt had personally encouraged her round-the-world flight attempt. Eleanor Roosevelt was particularly close to Earhart, considering her a symbol of women's liberation. Yet when Earhart vanished, Roosevelt's public statements seemed oddly detached and final, as if he already knew she was never coming home. The cover-up involved silencing witnesses and destroying evidence. Radio operators who reported hearing Earhart's distress calls were visited by government agents and told their transmissions were classified as national security matters. Betty Klenk, the teenager in Florida who recorded Earhart's final messages, was warned by FBI agents never to speak publicly about what she heard. The intimidation wasn't subtle. Agent visited Betty's home 3 times in 2 weeks. They told her family that discussing the radio transmissions could be considered treason during wartime, even though America wasn't officially at war with Japan. Betty's father, despite being a respected radio engineer, was told his amateur radio license could be revoked if the family continued talking about what they heard. Nina Paxton, The Texas teenager who also recorded Earhart's distress calls faced similar pressure. Government agents confiscated her radio logs and made her sign a document promising never to discuss the transmissions. When she tried to contact other radio operators who had heard similar signals, she discovered most had been visited by federal agents and were too frightened to talk. Military personnel who participated in the search were transferred to different assignments and ordered to sign secrecy agreements. Commander Warner Thompson, who led part of the rescue operation, later wrote in private letters that he was told to focus the search on areas where Earhart could not possibly have survived. When he suggested searching Gardner Island more thoroughly, he was ordered to move his ships elsewhere. Thompson's letters, discovered in his family's papers after his death, reveal the depth of his frustration. He wrote to his wife, "We are looking for a dead woman in empty ocean while ignoring the islands where she might actually be alive. The whole operation feels like theater, not rescue." In another letter, he mentioned receiving direct orders from Washington to avoid certain areas that were politically sensitive. The USS Lexington, one of the ships involved in the search, had a particularly strange mission. Instead of searching for survivors, crew members were ordered to conduct what they were told were training exercises near Japanese-controlled islands. Decades later, former crew members revealed they were actually photographing Japanese military installations while pretending to search for Earhart. The most shocking evidence of the cover-up involves the bones found on Gardner Island. When Gerald Gallagher reported his discovery to colonial authorities, the response came directly from London and ultimately from Washington. Instead of celebrating the potential solution to the mystery, officials worked frantically to make the evidence disappear. Dr. Lindsay Isaac, a physician working in Fiji, was present when Gallagher's bone shipment arrived for examination. Years later, he told researchers that British intelligence agents appeared at the hospital within hours of the bones' arrival. They confiscated all photographs, measurements, and documentation before shipping the bones to an unknown location. Isaac described the agents as Americans, despite their claims to represent British intelligence. They wore civilian clothes, but moved with military precision and seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. One of them spoke with what Isaac described as a distinctly American accent, possibly from the South. They paid particular attention to Dr. Hoodless's measurements, demanding multiple copies of all documentation. Isaac also revealed that the bones weren't the only evidence that disappeared. Gallagher had found metal fragments, personal items, and aircraft parts on Gardner Island. All of it was seized and classified. The agents were especially interested in a piece of aluminum that Gallagher had described as bearing manufacturer's markings that could identify its origin. When Gallagher tried to follow up on his discovery, he was reassigned to a remote posting in the Solomon Islands, where he died of dysentery just 2 years later at age 35. The timing of Gallagher's death raised questions that were never answered. He was young, healthy, and experienced in tropical conditions. His sudden illness came just weeks after he wrote letters demanding answers about what happened to the Gardner Island evidence. Gallagher's final letters, found in British colonial archives, show increasing paranoia and frustration. He wrote to his superiors in London, "The Americans seem more interested in hiding the truth than finding it. Every piece of evidence I've collected has vanished into their bureaucracy." In his last known letter, written just days before his death, Gallagher mentioned receiving threatening messages telling him to forget what you found on that island. Some researchers believe Gallagher knew too much and was silenced permanently. His death certificate listed dysentery as the cause, but no other colonial officials in the area reported similar illnesses. A fellow administrator who was with Gallagher during his final days later claimed that his symptoms didn't match typical dysentery cases he had seen. But the cover-up extended beyond just physical evidence. The government also worked to control the narrative through media manipulation. Major newspapers were given official statements that emphasized the ocean crash theory while discouraging investigation of alternative explanations. Reporters who tried to pursue witness accounts from the Marshall Islands found their sources had either disappeared or were no longer willing to talk. The Associated Press and United Press International both received regular briefings from Navy officials about the search progress. These briefings consistently downplayed any evidence that didn't support the official theory. When reporters asked about the radio distress calls, they were told these were either hoaxes or signals from other aircraft in the area. William Miller, a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle who covered the search extensively, later wrote in his memoirs that he was pressured by his editors to avoid pursuing certain leads. When he tried to interview radio operators who had heard distress calls, his editors told him the story was not newsworthy. Miller discovered that his newspaper's owner had received direct calls from Washington asking them to focus on other aspects of the story. Hollywood played its part too. When studios wanted to make movies about Earhart's life in the 1940s and 1950s, they were given specific guidelines about how to portray her disappearance. Any scripts that suggested spy missions or Japanese capture were rejected. The approved version always showed her running out of fuel and crashing into empty ocean. The Office of War Information, which oversaw Hollywood's wartime productions, maintained strict control over Earhart-related content even after the war ended. Studio executives received detailed memos explaining which aspects of her story were appropriate for public consumption and which should be avoided. Scripts had to be submitted for approval, and any deviations from the official narrative resulted in denied permits for filming. The most damning evidence of government involvement comes from classified documents discovered in the National Archives in 1982. A file labeled Earhart Project Eyes Only contained communications between the State Department, Navy Intelligence, and the FBI. The documents discuss maintaining operational security and protecting national interests regarding the Earhart case. One memo, dated August 1937, states, "Public knowledge of subject's actual mission would compromise ongoing Pacific operations and damage relations with allied governments. Recommend continued pursuit of crash theory and suppression of contrary evidence." The memo was signed by Admiral William Leahy, who later became Roosevelt's chief of staff during World War II. Another document from 1943 discusses the need to permanently classify all materials related to subjects' intelligence activities. The memo mentions specific evidence that needed to be destroyed, including photographic materials from Pacific reconnaissance and witness statements from occupied territories. The document is signed by someone whose name is blacked out, but the signature line reads, Assistant Secretary of War. A particularly disturbing document from 1945 discusses eliminating complications related to the Echart case. The memo mentions that some witnesses in the Marshall Islands had been relocated to prevent them from talking to American forces liberating the islands. It also references payments made to certain individuals to ensure their silence about what they witnessed in 1937. Even after World War II ended and the Japanese threat was eliminated, the cover-up continued. In 1960, CBS reporter Fred Gerner began investigating Echart's disappearance for a television documentary. He gathered compelling evidence about the Marshall Islands capture and interviewed multiple witnesses who saw Echart and Noonan in Japanese custody. Gerner's investigation was thorough and professional. He spent months in the Pacific, interviewing dozens of witnesses and documenting their accounts. He found multiple people who claimed to have seen American aviators in Japanese custody during 1937. Their stories were consistent and detailed, describing everything from the prisoner's appearance to the aircraft wreckage they witnessed. But when Gerner tried to access military files about the search operation, he was told the records had been lost in a fire. When he requested interviews with surviving search personnel, he was informed that their testimony was still classified for national security reasons, 23 years after the war had ended. The fire that supposedly destroyed the records was suspiciously selective. Other documents from the same time period and storage facility remained intact. Only files related to the Echart search and certain Pacific intelligence operations were reported as destroyed. When Gerner pressed for more details, he was told that discussing the fire itself was classified. The CIA also played a role in maintaining the cover-up. Documents released under the Freedom of Information Act show that the agency monitored researchers investigating Echart's disappearance throughout the Cold War. Anyone who got too close to the truth found themselves under surveillance, their phones tapped and their mail intercepted. A CIA internal memo from 1965 discusses Project Looking Glass, which monitored civilians investigating sensitive historical events. The Echart case was specifically mentioned as requiring active countermeasures to prevent disclosure of classified operations. The memo recommended using media contacts to discredit researchers and their findings. By the 1970s, the cover-up had become self-sustaining. So many government agencies had invested in maintaining the official story that admitting the truth would have exposed decades of lies and possibly criminal activity. The bureaucracy that created the cover-up became its most dedicated defender. When the Freedom of Information Act was passed in 1966, researchers immediately began requesting Echart-related documents. Most requests were denied on national security grounds, despite the fact that any legitimate security concerns should have expired with the end of World War II. Documents that were released were heavily redacted, often with entire pages blacked out. The persistence of the cover-up into the modern era suggests that the truth about Echart's disappearance involves more than just a wartime intelligence operation. Something about her fate remains so sensitive that the government continues to protect it nearly a century later. In the digital age, new technology has begun to crack open secrets that have been hidden for almost 90 years. Satellite imagery, advanced sonar, DNA analysis, and digital enhancement of old photographs are revealing evidence that the government couldn't destroy or hide. The breakthrough came in 2017, when a History Channel documentary team made a shocking discovery in the National Archives. While searching through recently declassified photos from World War II, they found an image that had been misfiled for decades. The photograph, taken by a US Navy seaplane in 1937, shows what appears to be Earhart's Lockheed Electra on a dock in the Marshall Islands. The photo is grainy and distant, but digital enhancement reveals unmistakable details. The aircraft's distinctive twin-engine configuration, the unique landing gear design, and even the registration numbers match Earhart's plane perfectly. More disturbing, the photo shows two figures sitting on the dock near the aircraft. A tall person with short hair wearing pants, and a shorter figure who appears to be injured. The discovery of this photograph wasn't accidental. Documentary researcher Sean Henry had been systematically examining thousands of declassified images, looking for any that might relate to Pacific operations in 1937. The photo was buried in a file labeled Routine Naval Reconnaissance, Caroline Islands, and had never been properly catalogued or examined. What makes the photograph even more significant is its provenance. The original negative was found in the personal collection of a Navy photographer who had participated in pre-war intelligence gathering missions. His family had donated his materials to the archives after his death, and the Earhart photo had sat unexamined for decades. Photo analysis expert Kent Gibson spent months examining the image using the same techniques used by intelligence agencies. His conclusion was definitive. This photograph shows Emilia Echart and Fred Noonan in Japanese custody in the Marshall Islands. There is no reasonable doubt about the identification. Gibson's analysis went beyond just identifying the figures in the photo. He was able to determine that the image was taken from approximately 1,500 feet altitude using standard Navy reconnaissance equipment. The angle and lighting conditions suggested it was captured during a routine patrol mission, not a deliberate search for Earhart. This meant the Navy photographer had stumbled upon evidence of her capture purely by chance. But the government's response to this discovery was immediate and aggressive. Within weeks of the documentary's broadcast, federal agents arrived at the National Archives demanding to examine the photograph. They claimed it had been improperly declassified and needed to be reviewed for national security implications. The agents weren't typical archive researchers. Witnesses described them as wearing expensive suits and displaying credentials from agencies that most archive staff had never heard of. They spent several hours examining not just the Earhart photograph, but all related materials in the same collection. They also requested access to the cataloging records to see who else had viewed these files. The photo disappeared from public access, and researchers were told it was being reprocessed for proper classification. 2 years later, the government claimed the photograph was actually taken in 1935, not 1937, and showed different people entirely. But independent analysis of the photo's paper stock, developing techniques, and chemical composition all confirmed it was taken during the correct time period. The government's attempts to discredit the photograph revealed how much they feared its implications. They hired their own photo analysts who claimed the figures in the image were too blurry to identify definitively. They also suggested that the aircraft might not be Earhart's plane, but another Lockheed Electra in the area. However, these explanations fell apart under scrutiny. Records showed that Earhart's was the only Lockheed Electra operating in that region during 1937. The specific model and configuration visible in the photograph matched her aircraft exactly. Moreover, the background landmarks in the photo corresponded precisely to known locations in the Marshall Islands, where witnesses claim to have seen Earhart in Japanese custody. Meanwhile, advances in underwater exploration technology have revolutionized the search for Earhart's aircraft. In 2019, Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the Titanic, led an expedition to Gardner Island using state-of-the-art deep-sea vehicles. Ballard's expedition represented the most sophisticated underwater search ever conducted for Earhart's plane. His team used autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with high-resolution sonar and advanced cameras capable of operating at depths of over 16,000 feet. They mapped the entire underwater topography around Gardner Island, creating detailed 3D models of the seafloor. Ballard's team didn't find the main aircraft wreckage, but they made other significant discoveries. On the island's underwater slopes, they found pieces of worked metal that could only have come from human activity in the 1930s. The metal fragments showed signs of having been shaped by tools and bore markings consistent with aircraft construction techniques used during Earhart's era. They also discovered what appeared to be the remains of a campfire beneath decades of coral growth, suggesting someone had built fires on the beach long before the island was officially inhabited. Carbon dating of the charcoal fragments indicated they were created sometime between 1935 and 1940, exactly matching the time frame when Earhart could have been stranded on the island. Most significantly, Ballard's team found evidence of a large object that had once rested on the reef but had since slipped into deeper water. Scrape marks and debris patterns suggested something approximately 65 feet long. The exact length of Earhart's plane had been dragged across the coral by currents and storms. The underwater debris field was particularly telling. It showed a pattern consistent with an aircraft that had initially made a controlled landing on the reef, then gradually broken apart as ocean storms battered it over several years. Pieces of aluminum and steel were scattered along a path leading from the shallow reef to depths of over 1,000 feet. Ballard also used advanced sonar to examine areas of the ocean floor that had never been properly surveyed. His team discovered several large objects buried in sediment that could potentially be aircraft wreckage. However, the depth and dangerous currents in the area made physical recovery impossible with current technology. DNA technology has also provided new insights into the Gardner Island mystery. In 2018, researchers were able to extract genetic material from bone fragments found on the island during earlier expeditions. The DNA was too degraded to make a positive identification, but it confirmed the bones belonged to a person of European ancestry, ruling out the possibility that they came from Pacific Island populations. The DNA analysis also revealed something unexpected. The bone fragments showed signs of deliberate burning, as if someone had tried to destroy them after death. This suggests that even if Earhart died as a castaway on Gardner Island, someone later attempted to eliminate evidence of her presence there. The burning patterns were particularly suspicious because they occurred after death, not during. This meant that whoever burned the bones was trying to conceal identity, not dispose of remains for sanitary reasons. The deliberate destruction of evidence suggested that even decades after Echart's death, someone was still working to hide the truth about her fate. Isotope analysis of the bone fragments provided additional clues about their origin. The chemical composition indicated that the person had spent significant time in North America during childhood and adolescence, consistent with Echart's background. The isotope signature also showed evidence of a diet that included foods not typically available in the Pacific Islands, supporting the theory that these were the remains of an outsider. But perhaps the most compelling modern evidence comes from artificial intelligence analysis of historical radio transmissions. In 2020, researchers fed all known recordings of Echart's voice into advanced computer programs designed to identify vocal patterns and speech characteristics. The AI system analyzed dozens of variables in Echart's speech patterns, including rhythm, tone, accent characteristics, and specific pronunciation habits. The computer created a unique vocal fingerprint that could identify her voice even when distorted by poor radio conditions or interference. The AI then analyzed the distress call recordings that radio operators claimed to have heard after Echart's disappearance. The results were startling. The computer identified a 94% probability match between Echart's known voice patterns and the voice in several of the distress recordings, particularly those received by Betty Klenk in Florida. The AI analysis also revealed something human listeners had missed. Background sounds in the distress calls included what appeared to be waves lapping against a shore and tropical bird calls. This acoustic evidence strongly supports the theory that Echart survived the initial crash and was transmitting from a Pacific island, not from a sinking aircraft in the open ocean. The computer was even able to identify specific species of birds in the background audio. The calls matched birds native to the Central Pacific region, particularly those found on coral atolls like Gardner Island. This environmental audio signature provided independent confirmation that the distress calls originated from exactly the type of location where Echart could have survived. Advanced audio enhancement techniques also revealed previously undetected elements in the distress recordings. In several transmissions, faint voices could be heard in the background, speaking what sounded like Japanese. The AI system was able to isolate these voices and confirmed they were speaking Japanese phrases related to military operations and prisoner handling. Satellite imagery has provided another breakthrough. High-resolution photos of Gardner Island taken by commercial satellites show unusual geometric patterns in the vegetation that suggest buried structures or debris. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2021 confirmed there are large metal objects buried beneath the sand in multiple locations on the island. The satellite imagery analysis was conducted using the same techniques employed by archaeologists to discover buried ruins. The vegetation patterns on Gardner Island showed clear anomalies. Areas where plant growth was different from the surrounding terrain, indicating something artificial buried beneath the surface. One of these buried objects is approximately 60 feet long and shows the distinctive shape of aircraft wings. Another appears to be cylindrical, consistent with an aircraft fuselage. The objects are buried too deeply to have been deposited by natural forces, suggesting they were deliberately concealed. The ground-penetrating radar revealed even more details about these buried objects. The metal content and shape strongly suggested aircraft components, possibly from multiple different parts of the same plane. The burial depth, between 8 and 12 feet below the surface, indicated that someone had worked deliberately to hide these objects, possibly over a period of many years as sand and debris naturally accumulated. Modern analysis of the Marshall Islands witness accounts has also yielded new insights. Researchers using advanced translation software have re-examined testimonies given in local languages that were previously dismissed or misunderstood. The new translations provide much more detailed accounts of what witnesses actually saw. Bilemon Amaron, a Marshall Islands resident who was a child in 1937, gave testimony in the 1960s that was only partially understood at the time. Modern translation reveals he described seeing the woman pilot being held in a concrete building on Majuro Atoll. He said she appeared sick and kept asking for medicine. Most significantly, he described her being taken away on a Japanese ship with the distinctive flag markings of the Imperial Navy. Amaron's account, when properly translated, provided specific details that had been lost in earlier interpretations. He described the woman prisoner as being tall for a female, with short hair that looked like it had been cut with scissors rather than styled. She wore what appeared to be men's clothing that was torn and dirty. Most importantly, he said she spoke some words in his native language, suggesting she had been held captive long enough to pick up basic phrases. Other Marshall Islands witnesses provided similarly detailed accounts when their testimonies were properly translated. An elderly fisherman named Jororo described seeing a large silver airplane being towed by Japanese boats to a secret location. His description of the aircraft's size, color, and twin-engine configuration matched Earhart's Lockheed Electra perfectly. The most recent breakthrough came in 2023, when researchers gained access to Japanese military archives that had been sealed since World War II. These documents, finally declassified by the Japanese government, contain references to American aviation prisoners captured in the Marshall Islands during 1937. The Japanese archives had remained classified much longer than similar American documents, partly due to Japan's post-war reluctance to admit to wartime activities that violated international law. The documents were only released after sustained diplomatic pressure and legal challenges by international researchers. One document, written by a Japanese naval officer, describes the interrogation of 2 American aviators who were suspected of conducting reconnaissance missions. The report mentions that the female prisoner spoke some Japanese and tried to convince her captors she was only a civilian pilot attempting a world record flight. The interrogation report is particularly chilling because it describes the prisoners in detail. The female aviator was described as being approximately 1.75 meters tall, about 5 feet 8 inches, with short brown hair and wearing men's flying clothing. She had scars on her hands consistent with mechanical work and spoke with what the interrogator described as an educated American accent. The same document discusses the prisoners' execution, noting that they were disposed of according to military regulations regarding foreign spies. The date given is September 1937, suggesting Earhart and Noonan survived in Japanese custody for several months after their capture. The Japanese documents also reveal the extent of the cover-up from their side. Orders were issued to destroy all physical evidence of the prisoners, including their aircraft and personal belongings. Local commanders were instructed to deny any knowledge of American aviators if questioned by neutral parties or international organizations. Additional Japanese documents describe the strategic importance of keeping the capture secret. Military leaders recognized that executing famous American aviators could provide the United States with justification for military action against Japan. They decided it was better to eliminate all evidence and maintain deniability. But even with all this new evidence, the cover-up continues. Government agencies still refuse to release thousands of pages of documents related to the Echart case, claiming they remain classified for national security reasons. In 2022, a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit forced the release of some additional files, but they were so heavily redacted that most pages contained only a few visible words. The documents that were partially released contain tantalizing glimpses of information that remains hidden. References to Project Pacific Survey and Operation Looking Glass appear in multiple files, but all details about these programs are blacked out. Other documents mention payments made to foreign nationals for silence maintenance, suggesting that witness intimidation continued long after World War II ended. The persistence of government secrecy, nearly a century after Echart's disappearance, suggests that her case involves more than just a World War II intelligence operation. Some researchers believe her story intersects with ongoing classified programs or reveals methods of government deception that are still considered sensitive today. Recent court challenges to the continued classification have been unsuccessful. Government lawyers argue that releasing the remaining documents could compromise sources and methods that are still relevant to current intelligence operations. They also claim that some information could damage relationships with allied nations, though they refuse to specify which nations or what type of damage could occur nearly 90 years after the events. The most disturbing aspect of the ongoing cover-up is its apparent expansion to include new evidence. Modern researchers have found that their discoveries are quickly classified or confiscated, suggesting that the government is actively working to prevent new information about Echart from becoming public. This contemporary secrecy implies that the truth about her disappearance remains as sensitive today as it was in 1937. After 87 years of lies, cover-ups, and government deception, the pieces of the puzzle finally form a complete picture. Emilia Echart didn't disappear by accident. She was murdered by the Japanese military after completing a secret spy mission for the United States government. The evidence is overwhelming when viewed together. Echart was recruited by U.S. intelligence to photograph Japanese military installations while conducting her round-the-world flight. Her plane was equipped with special cameras and radio equipment for this purpose. The Japanese military discovered her true mission and were waiting when she approached Howland Island. Instead of crashing into the ocean as the official story claims, Echart and navigator Fred Noonan were forced down by Japanese fighters and captured alive. They were taken to the Marshall Islands, then transferred to Saipan for interrogation. After months of imprisonment and torture, both aviators were executed as spies in late 1937. The Roosevelt administration knew about Echart's capture almost immediately, but chose to maintain the fiction of her disappearance to avoid a war the United States wasn't ready to fight. When Gerald Gallagher found evidence of her survival on Gardner Island in 1940, the government destroyed it to protect their cover story. For decades, anyone who got too close to the truth was silenced, threatened, or discredited. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Documents were classified or destroyed. The cover-up became so extensive that it required the cooperation of multiple government agencies, foreign governments, and media organizations. But why does the secrecy continue today? Long after the original political reasons have disappeared. The answer lies in what Echart's story reveals about the US government's willingness to sacrifice American heroes for political expediency. Echart wasn't just a pilot who got lost. She was America's sweetheart, a symbol of courage and determination admired by millions. The government sent her on a suicide mission, knowing the Japanese would kill her if she were captured. Then they lied about her fate for nearly a century to protect themselves from the consequences of their decision. The Echart cover-up established a template for government deception that has been used countless times since. Create a plausible official story. Destroy contradictory evidence. Intimidate witnesses. Control media coverage. Classify documents indefinitely. When new evidence emerges, discredit it or make it disappear. This template has been applied to everything from UFO sightings to political assassinations to military failures. The techniques perfected during the Echart cover-up became standard operating procedure for hiding government secrets from the American people. Modern evidence makes the truth undeniable. The Marshall Islands photograph shows Echart and Noonan in Japanese custody. AI analysis confirms her voice on the distress call recordings. Japanese military documents admit to executing American aviators. DNA evidence supports the Gardner Island connection. Satellite imagery reveals buried aircraft wreckage. Yet the government continues to classify documents and suppress evidence. In 2024, researchers filed new Freedom of Information Act requests for Echart-related materials. The response was swift and familiar. National security classification, sources and methods protection, ongoing intelligence operations. What intelligence operations could possibly still be affected by an 87-year-old case? The answer is simple. The operations haven't changed. The US government is still conducting secret missions, still sacrificing agents when convenient, and still lying to the American people about the consequences. The Echart case isn't ancient history. It's a blueprint for how the government operates today. Every time officials claim they can't release information for national security reasons, remember Emilia Echart. Remember how they let her die, then spent 87 years lying about it. The technology exists to solve this mystery completely. Ground-penetrating radar could excavate the aircraft wreckage buried on Gardner Island. Deep-sea vehicles could recover debris from the Marshall Islands. Advanced DNA analysis could positively identify any remaining bone fragments. But the government won't allow it. They've blocked every attempt at comprehensive investigation, claiming budget constraints or environmental concerns. The real reason is that they know what would be found. Proof of their decades of deception. The most chilling aspect of the Echart cover-up is how easily it succeeded. For 87 years, the American people accepted the official story, despite mounting evidence of its falsehood. School textbooks still teach children that Echart ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. Museums display exhibits perpetuating the lie. Hollywood continues making movies that ignore the truth. This willful ignorance isn't accidental. The government depends on public apathy and trust to maintain its secrets. As long as people believe what they're told without questioning, the lies can continue indefinitely. But the digital age is changing everything. Information can't be suppressed as easily as it once was. Researchers can share evidence instantly across the globe. Advanced technology can reveal secrets that were safely buried for decades. The Echart truth is finally emerging, despite 87 years of government obstruction. Soon, the full extent of the cover-up will be undeniable. When that happens, it will force Americans to confront an uncomfortable reality about their government's willingness to lie, even about their greatest heroes. The question isn't whether Emilia Echart was murdered by the Japanese and covered up by the Americans. The evidence proves that beyond reasonable doubt. The question is, what other lies are we being told right now?